The divorce papers were signed in a hospital hallway that still smelled of antiseptic and blood. Marilyn Lynn Parker lay unconscious behind double doors, her body stitched together after an emergency C-section that saved 3 premature babies. Machines hummed. Red lights blinked. Somewhere inside, a nurse whispered prayers. Outside, Grant Holloway adjusted his tailored suit, took the pen, and signed his name without hesitation. 10 minutes earlier, Lynn had almost died. Grant didn't ask if his children were breathing on their own. He didn't ask if his wife would wake up. He only asked the lawyer one question: how fast this could be finalized. The answer was simple, immediate, clean, silent, exactly how he liked it. A doctor stepped out, exhaustion carved into her face. "Your wife is critical," she said. "She needs—" "I'm no longer her husband," Grant interrupted, sliding the folder closed. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Update her family." "And, by name?" "There is no family," the doctor replied. Grant paused for half a second, then nodded as if that solved everything. He turned and walked away, leather shoes echoing down the corridor, past framed photos of smiling newborns and hopeful parents. Behind him, 3 infants fought for air in clear plastic incubators. By morning, Lynn would wake up divorced, uninsured, and legally powerless over her own children. Grant, meanwhile, rode down to the underground garage, where his black Mercedes waited with the engine running. He checked his phone. A message from Brielle Knox lit the screen. "Is it done?" He typed back one word. "Yes." As the car pulled into Manhattan traffic, Grant allowed himself a smile. The timing was perfect. No messy custody battles. No fragile wife slowing him down. In 6 weeks, his company would enter its most important funding round. Investors wanted strength, not sentiment. A man who cut ties cleanly. Up in the ICU, a nurse gently placed Lynn's trembling hand against the glass of the incubator. The babies were alive, but barely. Lynn's lips moved as if trying to apologize to them for something she didn't yet understand. What no one in that hallway knew, not the doctors, not the lawyers, not even Grant himself, was that the moment he signed those papers, he triggered a chain of consequences that would dismantle everything he believed he owned. And the woman he had just erased was about to become the most dangerous mistake of his life. Marilyn Lynn Parker woke to the sound of alarms she didn't recognize, and a weight in her body that felt wrong, like something had been taken and not returned. Her throat was dry, her head throbbed. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she couldn't move her legs. Then the pain rushed back. She tried to sit up, but a sharp ache tore through her abdomen, forcing a gasp from her lips. A nurse hurried to her side, pressing a gentle hand against her shoulder. "Easy," the woman said softly. "You've been through a lot." "My babies," Lynn whispered. Her voice cracked, raw from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. "Where are my babies?" The nurse hesitated. "Not long, but long enough. They're in the NICU," she said. "They're alive, fighting. Very small, but stable for now." Relief flooded Lynn so fast it made her dizzy. Tears slid down the sides of her face and soaked into the pillow. "Can I see them?" The nurse looked away. "There are some things we need to go over first." A man Lynn had never seen stepped into the room, holding a tablet instead of flowers. He wore a hospital badge that didn't list him as medical staff. "Mrs. Parker," he said, then corrected himself without apology. "Miss Parker, Antoinito." The word landed harder than the surgery. "There's been a change to your marital status," he continued, voice flat and professional. "Your divorce was finalized early this morning." Lynn stared at him, certain she had misheard. "That's not possible," she said. "I was unconscious." "Yes," he replied, "but the paperwork was valid." Her heart began to race. Grant wouldn't. He already did. The man tapped the screen and turned it toward her. Grant's signature stared back at her, bold and familiar. Her own name appeared beneath it, printed, authorized, executed. The date, the time, everything precise, everything final. "You're no longer covered under Mr. Holloway's insurance," he went on. "Hospital administration has reassigned your room. Your children's medical decisions are currently under review, pending custody clarification." Lynn's fingers curled into the sheets. "Those are my children." "As never stem." "Legally," he said, "that's being determined." The room began to spin. "Where is he?" she demanded. "I want to see my husband." The man met her eyes for the first time. Mr. Holloway has declined further involvement. After he left, the nurse returned with a wheelchair instead of comfort. Lynn was transferred to a smaller room on a different floor. No windows, no monitors, no warmth. She was given a thin blanket and a clipboard of forms she could barely read through the tears. Hours later, she was wheeled past the NICU. She saw them through the glass, 3 tiny bodies wrapped in wires and plastic, fighting battles she couldn't fight for them. She reached out, but the chair kept moving. That was when Lynn finally understood the truth. She hadn't just been divorced. She had been erased. And as she lay alone that night, clutching the hospital bracelet Grant had paid to remove, a knock sounded softly at her door, one that would change everything she believed about how alone she truly was. Grant Holloway stood in front of the mirror in his Park Avenue penthouse, adjusting the cuffs of his custom shirt as sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan stretched below him, sharp and obedient, exactly how he liked it. Everything was quiet, controlled, clean, just the way he planned. His phone buzzed on the marble counter. A calendar alert. Investor breakfast, 9 a.m. He took a sip of black coffee, scrolling through overnight messages, congratulatory notes, a few cautious inquiries, no resistance, no backlash. The divorce had gone through exactly as his lawyer promised. Efficient. He hadn't slept much, but it didn't matter. He felt lighter than he had in months. No more hospital visits. No more emotional landmines. No more explanations. Lynn had become a liability the moment the pregnancy turned complicated. 3 premature babies were not a blessing in his world. They were a risk, and risk was something Grant Holloway eliminated early. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he had memorized long before the ink on the divorce papers dried. "It's done," he said when Brielle answered. She laughed softly on the other end, the sound bright and relieved. "I told you it would work out. You just needed to be decisive." "Enfer." Grant smiled. "I always am." Brielle was already waiting for him at the plaza later that night, coordinating a small, strategic appearance. Nothing public yet, just enough to plant the idea, a fresh start, a new image, a woman who fit beside him instead of slowing behind. As he stepped into the elevator, Grant allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The narrative was his to control now. He was the CEO who made hard choices, the man who didn't let personal weakness interfere with professional growth. No one would ask where Lynn went. By mid-morning, he sat at the head of a glass conference table overlooking Wall Street, fingers wrapped around a Montblanc pen as he spoke to potential investors. He talked numbers, growth, expansion, confidence radiated from him. "This company is entering its strongest phase," Grant said smoothly. "No distractions, no instability." The men across from him nodded, impressed. Then his assistant slipped into the room and leaned close. "Sir," she whispered, "there's an issue with one of the funding channels." Grant frowned. "Which one?" "The Parker Hale Trust." The name barely registered. "We don't work with them." "Not directly," she said carefully, "but their capital influences 2 of our secondary partners. They've paused pending review." Grant leaned back, masking irritation. "That's temporary." "Yes," she replied, "but they've requested updated disclosures on personal risk exposure." Grant's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." The meeting resumed, but something had shifted. For the first time that day, Grant felt a faint edge of unease. He pushed it away. He had lawyers, advisors, influence. This was nothing. Outside, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He ignored it. Up in a quiet hospital room across the city, Marilyn Lynn Parker stared at the ceiling, unaware that her name had just surfaced in rooms Grant believed she would never enter. And as Grant stood to shake hands with investors, convinced he had cut the past cleanly away, the message he ignored waited patiently on his screen. Because the system he trusted was already moving against him, and the woman he discarded had become the silent variable he could no longer control. The transfer happened without ceremony. Marilyn Lynn Parker woke from a shallow sleep to the sound of wheels rolling and voices she didn't recognize. Her chart was lifted from the foot of her bed. The IV pole rattled as it was disconnected and reattached. No one explained anything until she asked, her voice thin and unsteady. "Where are you taking me?" A nurse avoided her eyes. "Administration orders. Thanks for watching." They moved her from the private recovery wing Grant had insisted on months earlier to a general postpartum floor on the other side of the hospital. The lighting was harsher, the walls were bare. The room smelled faintly of bleach instead of lavender sanitizer. Her new bed squeaked when she shifted, and the blanket was so thin she could feel the chill through it. Lynn stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how things had changed so fast. An hour later, a billing coordinator appeared with a practiced smile and a clipboard full of numbers. "We just need to review your coverage," she said brightly. Lynn swallowed. "My husband." The woman's fingers paused for a fraction of a second. "Your former husband terminated authorization this morning." The words settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. "So what does that mean?" Lynn asked. "It means," the coordinator replied, lowering her voice, "that extended NICU care for your children will require alternative arrangements." Lynn's heart slammed against her ribs. "They're premature. They need machines." "Yes," the woman said gently, "which is why we need confirmation of payment responsibility." Payment, responsibility. Words that felt obscene when spoken about 3 infants fighting to breathe. That afternoon, Lynn was wheeled past the NICU again, this time intentionally. She begged the orderly to stop. Just for a moment. He hesitated, then slowed. She pressed her palm against the glass. 3 incubators. 3 lives. One of them twitched weakly, a tiny hand curling around nothing. "I'm here," Lynn whispered, though they couldn't hear her. "I'm not leaving." Behind her, a voice cleared. "Miss Parker," a hospital administrator said, tone clipped. "We need to discuss discharge planning." "Discharge?" Lynn turned, panic rising. "I can't be discharged. I can barely walk." "Medically," the woman replied, "you are stable enough to recover at home." "I don't have a home," Lynn said. The administrator nodded once, as if that had already been noted. "You'll need to arrange temporary accommodation." The cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't shout or threaten. It moved through paperwork and policy, signatures and silence. By evening, Lynn's meals were downgraded. Her pain medication was reduced. Visiting privileges were restricted due to capacity. In a residency, she lay alone, listening to the distant cries of other newborns, wondering if her children cried the same way. Across the city, Grant Holloway signed off on the final insurance cancellation with the same efficiency he applied to quarterly reports. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It was necessary. Hospitals found solutions. People adjusted. Back in her room, Lynn stared at her phone, scrolling through unanswered messages she had sent Grant hours earlier. None delivered, all blocked. Her hands trembled as she typed one final message she knew would never be read. "They need me. Please." She didn't send it. Instead, she curled onto her side, protecting a body that had already given everything it had, and let the truth settle fully for the first time. Grant hadn't just left. He was actively making sure she couldn't survive without him. And as the lights dimmed and Lynn closed her eyes, unaware eyes were already watching this injustice closely. A single decision was made somewhere else in the hospital, one that would quietly undo Grant's careful cruelty. The decision was made in a quiet office at the end of the ICU corridor, far from the administrators and their clipboards. Dr. Naomi Reed stood with her arms crossed, staring at the medical chart glowing on her computer screen. 3 patient IDs. 3 premature infants. All born under extreme conditions. All requiring advanced respiratory support. All suddenly flagged for financial review. She had seen this before. Not often, but enough to recognize it when it happened. Power stepping in where compassion should have been. Naomi removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She had been a neonatologist for over 20 years. She had watched babies survive impossible odds and watched others slip away because someone higher up decided their lives were too expensive. The system never called it cruelty. It called it policy. A junior nurse knocked lightly on the open door. "Dr. Reed, administration wants confirmation on the Parker triplets." Naomi looked up. "Confirmation of what?" "That we're prepared to downgrade intervention if coverage lapses," the nurse said quietly, shame flickering across her face. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not." She stood and walked briskly toward the NICU, heels echoing with purpose. The room was dim, filled with the steady rhythm of machines doing the work. Lungs were too small to manage alone. She stopped at the first incubator, watching the baby's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. "They're stable," Naomi said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Fragile, but stable. She pulled up the mother's file. Marilyn Parker. 31. Emergency C-section. Severe blood loss. No next of kin listed. Divorced hours after surgery. Naomi's eyes narrowed. She walked back to her office and opened a secure file folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside were copies of incident reports, sworn statements, and legal guidance she had saved after a similar case nearly destroyed a young mother's life a decade earlier. She picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. Ethan Cole. A man answered after 2 rings. "It's Naomi Reed," she said. "I need legal counsel, not for the hospital, for a patient." There was a pause. "That's a rare call," Ethan replied. "What's happening?" Naomi explained everything. The divorce, the insurance termination, the attempt to pressure medical decisions based on money. When she finished, the line was silent for a long moment. "Do you know who Marilyn Parker is?" Ethan finally asked. "No," Naomi said honestly. "Just that she's being crushed." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then listen carefully. Do not let them move those babies. Document everything, every conversation, every request, every signature." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Why?" "Because," he said, voice grave, "this isn't just a custody dispute. This name is connected to a trust that hasn't surfaced in over a decade." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She had trusted her instinct, and it hadn't failed her. She returned to the NICU and spoke to her team with calm authority. "No changes to treatment plans without my approval. If anyone pressures you, send them to me." That evening, Naomi visited Lynn's room herself. Lynn looked small in the hospital bed, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "I'm Dr. Reed," Naomi said gently. "I oversee the NICU." Lynn struggled to sit up. "Are my babies?" "They're alive," Naomi said firmly. "And they will stay that way." Tears spilled down Lynn's cheeks. "They're trying to take them from me." Naomi took her hand. Not without a fight. As Naomi left the room, she sent one final email marked confidential, attaching every documented irregularity. Somewhere across the city, a legal mechanism long dormant began to stir. And for the first time since Grant Holloway signed those papers, the balance quietly shifted. The knock came just after midnight, soft but deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to a nurse making rounds. Marilyn Lynn Parker stirred from a restless half-sleep, her body aching in places she hadn't known could hurt. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. Then the knock came again. "Yes," she whispered. The door opened slowly. A man in his early 40s stepped inside, tall, neatly dressed, his coat folded over one arm as if he had come straight from somewhere important. He didn't look like hospital staff. He looked like someone who lived in conference rooms and courtrooms. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said quietly. "I'm here because Dr. Naomi Reed asked me to come." Lynn pushed herself up on the pillow, panic flaring. "Is something wrong with my babies?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "They're stable. This isn't about their condition. It's about your name." She frowned. "You already know my name." "Yes," he replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "But I don't think you know what it means." Lynn let out a bitter laugh. "It means I trusted the wrong man." End quote. Ethan didn't smile. "It means Parker." The word hung in the air, unfamiliar and heavy. "My mother's maiden name," Lynn said slowly. "Why?" Ethan opened his briefcase and removed a single sealed envelope, thick and yellowed with age. "Because your grandmother, Eleanor Parker Hale, built one of the most private investment trusts on the East Coast, and you are listed as her sole surviving beneficiary." Lynn stared at him. Certain exhaustion had finally pushed her into hallucination. "That's not possible," she said. "My grandmother died years ago. If there was money, someone would have told me." "They tried," Ethan said gently, "but the trust was locked in litigation. Family disputes, challenges. It's been frozen for 12 years. Lynn's chest tightened. "So why now?" "Because of a clause," Ethan replied. "One that activates only after the birth of legitimate heirs. Multiple heirs, to be exact." Her breath caught. "My children?" "Yes." The room felt suddenly too small. "So, what does that mean?" Lynn asked. "That I have access to it now?" Ethan shook his head. "Not immediately. There's a mandatory review period, 90 days. Until then, the assets remain inaccessible." Hope flared, then dimmed. "So it doesn't help me," she said softly. "Not now." It helps you more than you realize, Ethan said, because from the moment that clause was triggered, you became legally protected. He leaned forward. Your ex-husband's actions, cutting insurance, interfering with medical care, are now documented as attempts to leverage financial harm against a protected beneficiary. Lynn's hands trembled. Grant didn't know any of this. No, Ethan said, and that may be his biggest mistake. Tears slid down Lynn's cheeks, this time not from despair, but from something sharp and unfamiliar. Validation. Proof that she hadn't been wrong to feel erased. So, what happens now? She asked. Ethan closed the briefcase. Now, we wait. And we make sure you and your children survive long enough to collect what was always meant to be yours. He stood, pausing at the door. One more thing. From this moment on, everything Grant does will be watched. After he left, Lynn lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. For the first time since she woke up alone, she didn't feel invisible. Because somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a dormant empire had just recognized its rightful heir, and it was only a matter of time before the man who cast her aside realized who he had truly divorced. The 90-day review period sounded reasonable on paper. In real life, it felt like a sentence. Marilyn Lynn Parker was discharged 2 days later with a prescription she couldn't afford to refill and instructions that assumed she had a home, support, and rest waiting for her. None of that existed. She left the hospital in a borrowed coat, her hospital bag lighter than when she had arrived months earlier. No babies in her arms, just paperwork and pain. At the curb, she hesitated before opening her phone. She had $47 left in her account, enough for one ride. She chose an Uber instead of a taxi because it was cheaper, not because she knew where she was going. Where to? The driver asked. Lynn swallowed. Anywhere with a long-term stay discount. To Tesco. The driver nodded without judgment and pulled into traffic. The temporary studio she found was on the edge of Queens, small and quiet, with a bed that creaked and a kitchenette that barely worked. It smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning solution. Lynn didn't care. It was a place to lie down without being told she was costing someone money. Every morning, she returned to the hospital by subway, body stiff with healing muscles and stitched skin. She stood outside the NICU glass for hours, memorizing every monitor number, every nurse's face. She learned the sound of each baby's breathing machine. One was stronger, one was slower. One frightened her every time the alarm dipped. She wasn't allowed to touch them yet. Soon, they kept saying. Grant Holloway never came. On day 5, a letter arrived at the studio, forwarded by the hospital. Official. Heavy. It informed Lynn that her former husband had filed for emergency custody review, citing maternal instability and lack of financial capacity. Her hands shook as she read it twice, then a third time. That night, she called Ethan Cole. He's trying to take them, she said, voice breaking. I know, Ethan replied calmly. He filed the moment he realized the trust was involved. So he does know now, Lynn whispered. He knows something, Ethan corrected. But not enough. It's Rishand. The next week tested her in ways surgery never had. Her pain flared without medication. Sleep came in fragments. Some days she skipped meals to save money for transportation. She learned how cold New York could feel when you were invisible. Grant, meanwhile, told anyone who asked that Lynn was unwell and refusing help. Brielle Knox appeared beside him at dinners and charity meetings, hand resting confidently on his arm. Photos surfaced online. Smiles, champagne, control. Lynn saw them once, accidentally, on a cracked phone screen while sitting alone on the subway. She didn't cry. On the 12th day, one of the babies crashed. Lynn was called in from the hallway and watched doctors move with frightening speed. She pressed her hands together so tightly her knuckles went white, whispering promises she didn't know how to keep. They stabilized the baby, barely. That night, Lynn sat on the edge of the studio bed, staring at the wall, exhaustion dragging her under. 90 days felt impossible. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Miss Parker, this is Julian Cross. Ethan Cole suggested we speak. I believe I can help, but not the way you expect. Lynn stared at the screen, heart pounding. Because for the first time since everything fell apart, someone wasn't offering sympathy. They were offering leverage. Marilyn Lynn Parker, didn't reply to the message right away. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, phone glowing in her hands, rereading the name, Julian Cross. It meant nothing to her. Yet Ethan Cole wouldn't have suggested the call lightly. Ethan didn't waste favors. He didn't introduce people without reason. She typed back a single word. How? The response came almost instantly. Meet me. Tomorrow. Midtown. I'll send the address. I'm storing the tattoo. By the next afternoon, Lynn stood outside a quiet office building tucked between two glass towers near Bryant Park. No sign. No luxury logo. Just clean lines and a discreet security desk. She adjusted the borrowed coat around her shoulders and stepped inside, heart pounding harder with every step. Julian Cross rose when she entered the conference room. He was mid-40s, calm, unflashy, dressed in a simple dark suit that didn't try to impress. His eyes were observant, not curious, as if he had already read her story and was now studying the footnotes. "Miss Parker," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Lynn shook it, then sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You said you could help." "Yes," Julian replied. "But first, I need you to understand something. I'm not here to rescue you." She nodded slowly. "Good. I don't need saving." A flicker of approval crossed his face. "I know. What I offer is structure, time, and silence." End quote. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, neat and precise. Temporary housing arrangements near the hospital, a modest stipend labeled as a consultancy retainer, no mention of charity, no hint of pity. "This keeps you afloat during the review period," Julian said. "It doesn't touch the trust. It doesn't alert your ex-husband. And it doesn't compromise your legal position." Lynn stared at the papers. "Why?" Julian leaned back. "Because I have a long-standing interest in Parker Hale assets, and because I don't like bullies who mistake patience for weakness." She swallowed. "Grant doesn't know you." "He doesn't need to," Julian said. "Not yet." Lynn hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning since the hospital. "What happens if the review fails?" Julian's gaze didn't waver. "It won't. But even if it did, Grant would still lose." That caught her attention. "How?" "Because," Julian said calmly, "he's already overplayed his hand. Custody threats. Financial pressure. Public narrative manipulation. Judges don't like patterns, especially when they're documented." Lynn exhaled, something loosening in her chest. "So what do you need from me?" "Nothing," Julian replied. "Except one thing. Do not react. Let him think you're exhausted. Let him believe you're cornered." She gave a small, tired smile. "I am exhausted." "Yes," Julian said gently, "but you're not cornered anymore." Over the next 2 weeks, Lynn's life shifted quietly. She moved into a small furnished apartment 10 minutes from the hospital. She ate full meals again. She was finally allowed to touch her babies, skin to skin, whispering promises against their fragile warmth. Grant filed motions. He leaked concerns. He waited for her to break. She didn't. Late one night, as Lynn sat beside the NICU, one baby's tiny fingers curled around hers for the first time. She felt it then, not hope exactly, but certainty. The ground was no longer moving beneath her. And somewhere across the city, Grant Holloway mistook her silence for surrender, never realizing that the most dangerous phase of the game had just begun. Grant Holloway noticed the silence during the 3rd week. It wasn't dramatic. No angry messages, no emotional emails, no public accusations. Marilyn Lynn Parker had vanished from his radar so completely that it unsettled him. At first, he welcomed it. Silence meant compliance. It meant she was tired, overwhelmed, folding the way people like her always did. But silence, when it lasted too long, began to feel like something else. Grant sat in his office overlooking Wall Street, scrolling through his phone while a stock ticker crawled across the screen behind his desk. His assistant hovered nearby, tablet in hand. "Still nothing from Miss Parker," she said carefully. Grant scoffed. "Of course not. She's busy trying to survive." Yet he found himself checking anyway. Hospital updates, court filings, nothing new. Just the same slow process, the same waiting period, 90 days. An eternity for someone used to immediate results. At a private dinner that night, Brielle Knox leaned close, her manicured hand resting on his arm. "You've been distracted lately," she murmured. "Is this about her?" Grant stiffened. "She's irrelevant." Brielle smiled, unconvinced. Then why is her name still coming up in funding discussions? That caught him. What do you mean? I overheard someone at the gala, Brielle said casually. They mentioned Parker Hale again, quietly, like it was a sleeping giant. Grant's jaw tightened. It's nothing. But when he returned home, he poured himself a drink he didn't need and stared out at the city lights, unease crawling under his skin. He made a call to his legal team the next morning. I want an update on Parker, he said. Everything. The report came back thin, too thin. No breakdowns, no emergency motions, no financial desperation filings, nothing that matched the picture he'd painted of her collapse. Meanwhile, Lynn's days followed a steady rhythm Grant never imagined. She spent mornings in the NICU, afternoons resting, evenings reading court documents Ethan sent her on a borrowed tablet, not reacting. Not explaining, learning. Julian Cross checked in only when necessary. Short calls, precise updates. Let him talk, he told her once. Every word he says without you responding becomes evidence. And Grant did talk. He filed a revised custody motion, more aggressive this time, citing emotional unavailability and unstable living arrangements. He leaked concerns to a friendly journalist, careful not to name her directly. He wanted pressure, he wanted movement. What he got was nothing. No rebuttal. No interview. No breakdown. At the end of week 4, one of his secondary investors delayed a meeting, then another. Then a third requested clarification on personal litigation exposure. Grant snapped at his assistant, blamed timing, blamed the market. But late one evening, alone in his office, he pulled up a private memo he wasn't meant to see yet. It referenced a pending capital shift tied to legacy trust activation. His fingers froze over the keyboard. Parker Hale. Across the city, Lynn held her smallest baby against her chest, feeling the fragile rise and fall of life she had nearly lost. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of the waiting, because she understood something Grant didn't. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was control. And as Grant Holloway finally began to sense the ground shifting beneath him, he made the fatal mistake of pushing harder, never realizing that every move he made was now tightening the trap around his own future. Grant Holloway decided it was time to be seen. Silence had lingered too long, and in Grant's world, visibility was power. If investors were hesitating, if whispers were circling, then the solution was simple. Appear unbothered. Appear victorious. Control the narrative before it controlled him. The charity gala at the Plaza Hotel was perfect. Crystal chandeliers, black-tie dress code. Manhattan's financial elite gathered beneath gold-trimmed ceilings, sipping champagne and pretending not to watch one another too closely. Grant arrived exactly on time. Brielle knocks at his side, her hand resting possessively on his arm as cameras flashed. She wore a sleek ivory gown, expensive and deliberate. He wore confidence like a tailored jacket. Smile, Brielle murmured. They're watching. Grant smiled. He shook hands, laughed easily, spoke about growth and innovation. He spoke about stability, about focus, about a future unburdened by distractions. When asked about his personal life, he offered a rehearsed answer. Sometimes, he said lightly, you make hard decisions to protect what you're building. The line landed exactly as intended. Nods, understanding, approval. Across the room, investors whispered, not about Lynn but about Grant's composure, his strength, his decisiveness. The man looked untouchable. Grant felt the rush settle into his bones. This was his element. This was where he won. Brielle leaned closer as they paused near the balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. You see, she whispered, they're on your side. Grant nodded, scanning the room. Then his gaze snagged on something unexpected. Ethan Cole stood near the bar. Grant stiffened for just a moment before smoothing his expression. Ethan wasn't someone you ignored, but he also wasn't someone you challenged publicly. The man didn't belong to any one firm. He belonged to outcomes. Their eyes met briefly. Ethan gave a polite nod. Nothing more. Grant exhaled, telling himself it meant nothing. He was mid-conversation with a hedge fund partner when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Then it vibrated again. And again. Annoyed, Grant excused himself and stepped into a quieter corridor, checking the screen. A message from his CFO. We have a problem. Grant frowned and typed back quickly. Be specific. Thanks for watching. The reply came slower this time. One of our anchor investors has paused. They cited exposure concerns tied to a legacy trust review. Grant's stomach tightened. Which trust? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then the answer. Parker Hale. The corridor suddenly felt too warm. Grant typed furiously. That's not finalized. It's inactive. So we thought, the CFO replied. But someone has influence. Enough to make people nervous. And please. Grant slipped the phone back into his pocket and forced his shoulders straight. He returned to the ballroom with a practiced smile, laughter bubbling up as if nothing had changed. But the music sounded sharper now. The room felt smaller. Across the city, Marilyn Lynn Parker sat beside 3 bassinets in the NICU, her fingers resting lightly against the glass. She didn't know about the gala. She didn't need to. Because while Grant Holloway was busy proving his strength to the world, the foundation beneath his image had begun to crack. And this time, no amount of confidence would hold it together. The headlines never came. And that, more than anything, unsettled Grant Holloway. In the days following the gala, his name still appeared in business columns, still attached to phrases like resilient leadership and strong public confidence. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Invitations slowed. Calls were returned later than usual. Meetings that once locked in weeks ahead were suddenly under review. And Marilyn Lynn Parker remained invisible. Grant sat in his office early one morning, fingers drumming against the glass desk as his assistant stood frozen across from him. I can't get a location update, she said carefully. No recent hospital filings. No new motions. She hasn't responded to anything. Grant's lips tightened. She's hiding. Is Mentor. Or, the assistant said hesitantly, she doesn't need to respond. Grant shot her a sharp look. She lowered her eyes. Across Manhattan, speculation bloomed quietly. Not in tabloids, in boardrooms, in closed-door conversations between people who knew how power really moved. The Parker Hale Trust was being mentioned again, not loudly, but often enough to register. Who was controlling it? Why now? Why her? Ethan Cole's name appeared on a few discreet calendars. Julian Cross canceled 2 appearances without explanation. A senior partner at a private equity firm quietly sold off a minor stake connected to Grant's expansion plan. None of it was catastrophic. Yet, Grant tried to regain control, the only way he knew how, by escalating pressure. His legal team filed a request for a formal psychiatric evaluation of Lynn, citing postpartum trauma and emotional withdrawal. The language was polished, strategic, cruel in its restraint. He expected a reaction. He got silence. The court acknowledged receipt. Nothing more. That night, Grant poured himself a drink and stood alone in his penthouse, watching the city pulse below. Brielle was late. Again, he didn't care. His thoughts were fixed on one thing. She should be breaking by now. Meanwhile, Lynn's days unfolded quietly, deliberately. The babies were gaining weight, slowly, but enough to bring cautious smiles from nurses. She learned how to hold them without fear, how to read their breathing, how to sit still through hours of beeping machines. Julian Cross visited once, briefly. No flowers, no speeches. You're doing well, he said simply. I'm surviving, Lynn replied. That's enough for now. She didn't ask about Grant. She didn't need to. Ethan kept her informed with clipped updates. He's getting impatient, he told her over the phone. That's good. Why? Lynn asked. Because impatience leads to mistakes. One afternoon, as Lynn rocked her smallest child, a nurse mentioned something in passing. There was a call from a journalist earlier, she said, asking if you were still here. Lynn's hands stilled. What did you say? That we don't comment on patient status. Lynn nodded, heart steady. Grant had wanted the world to see her fall apart. Instead, she had disappeared entirely. No photos, no statements, no spectacle. And in a city where power depended on visibility, her absence had begun to speak louder than any accusation. Because when a woman vanishes without collapsing, people start to wonder, what does she know? Who is protecting her? What is coming next? Grant Holloway felt it in his bones, now the creeping awareness that he was no longer directing the story. He was reacting to it. And somewhere deep in the financial machinery he trusted so completely, Marilyn Lynn Parker's name was being repositioned not as a problem to manage, but as a force no one could afford to underestimate. Grant Holloway finally decided to reach out. Not publicly, not through lawyers, personally. The message arrived late in the evening, slipping through channels he believed still belonged to him. "We should talk," it read, "for the children, for closure." End quote. Lynn stared at the screen from the small kitchen table of her temporary apartment. One baby sleeping against her chest, the other two finally strong enough to remain in the NICU overnight, without alarms screaming every hour. She didn't answer right away. She forwarded the message to Ethan Cole. The reply came minutes later. "Good, he's ready." 2. The meeting was set for 3 days later. In a neutral space, Grant chose himself a private conference room in a midtown office building he frequently used for negotiations. He wanted control. Familiar ground. Lynn agreed without conditions. When she arrived, Grant was already there, standing near the window, phone in hand. He turned as she entered, his expression carefully calibrated. Concern. Regret. Authority softened just enough to appear human. "Lynn," he said quietly, "you look tired." "I'm stirred." She didn't respond to the comment. She sat across from him, hands folded, posture composed but subdued, exactly as Julian had advised. Grant exhaled, as if the sight of her had confirmed something he'd already decided. "This doesn't have to be a war," he began. "We can fix this before it damages the kids." "The kids are in the hospital," Lynn said calmly. "They don't know there's a war." Grant nodded, as if conceding a point. "That's why we need stability. Courts don't like uncertainty. Neither do investors." There it was, the truth slipping through the cracks. "I've spoken to my attorneys," he continued. "If you agree to a cooperative arrangement, shared custody, controlled support, mutual non-disclosure, we can resolve everything quickly." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a settlement proposal. Generous by appearances, monthly support, a housing allowance, legal fees covered. In exchange, Lynn would waive claims to future assets, public statements, and any associated third-party interests. Grant watched her carefully as she read. Her hands didn't shake, her face didn't change. "This is more than I expected," she said softly. Grant relaxed, just a little. "I want to be fair." She looked up at him. "Why now?" "Because dragging this out helps no one," he replied smoothly, "and because I know you're struggling." The lie was clean, practiced. Lynn lowered her eyes. "I don't want to fight," she said. "I'm so tired." Grant reached across the table, placing his hand near hers, without touching. "Then don't. Sign this. Let me handle the rest." A pause stretched between them. Then Lynn nodded. "I'll sign," she said. Grant masked his relief quickly, but it was there. He pushed a pen toward her, Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive. What he didn't notice was the second document beneath the settlement, nearly identical in appearance, quietly included in the stack. An addendum, perfectly legal, triggered only if activated by a protected trust review. Ethan Cole had drafted it himself. Lynn signed where Grant indicated. Once, twice, initialed the margins. Grant signed last, barely glancing at the pages. He was already winning in his mind. When it was done, he stood and extended his hand. "This is the best outcome," he said. Lynn shook his hand. "Thank you," she replied. As she walked out, Grant smiled to himself, certain he had finally closed the chapter. He didn't know that by signing that agreement, he had unknowingly acknowledged the trust he was trying to outrun and surrendered the leverage he didn't realize was keeping him afloat. Because the paper he'd just signed wasn't a peace offering. It was consent. And the trap was now fully set. The first call came at 6:42 a.m. Grant Holloway was halfway through his morning workout, the Manhattan skyline still washed in pale gray light, when his phone buzzed against the marble counter. He frowned at the caller ID, his CFO. Calling before markets opened was never a good sign. "What is it?" Grant asked, already irritated. "We've got a problem," the CFO said, voice tight. 3 partners froze capital movement overnight. Grant grabbed a towel. "Temporary?" "No, indefinite." They cited clause alignment issues. Grant's jaw clenched. "Which clauses?" There was a pause on the line. "Too long. Those tied to the amended agreement you signed last week," the CFO said carefully. "The one referencing protected beneficiary exposure." Grant felt a flicker of annoyance. That was boilerplate. "That's what we thought," the CFO replied, "but legal disagrees." Grant ended the call without responding. By 9 o'clock, his inbox was full. Requests for clarification, postponed meetings, a calendar once packed with certainty, now riddled with yellow alerts and tentative reschedules. Grant sat at his desk, Montblanc pen spinning between his fingers, forcing calm. He had signed hundreds of documents over the years. He didn't make mistakes like this. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting. "Legal wants to see you. Now." In the conference room, two attorneys sat with tablets open, expressions grim. A third screen displayed a highlighted paragraph from the agreement Grant had signed with Lynn. "This addendum," one lawyer began, "triggers disclosure obligations under trust-linked exposure laws." Grant leaned forward. "What trust?" The room went silent. "The Parker Hale Trust," the lawyer said. "Your signature acknowledges awareness of its activation." Grant laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "That trust doesn't even exist anymore." "It does," the lawyer replied, "and it's active." It's a?" Grant's stomach dropped. "Since when?" "Since the birth of the triplets." The words hit him like a delayed impact. "You're saying," Grant said slowly, "that by signing that agreement, I confirmed knowledge of a trust I didn't know about?" "Yes," the lawyer said. "Which means any actions taken before or after could be interpreted as financial coercion." Grant stood abruptly. "This is insane. She doesn't have access to anything yet." "Access isn't the point," the second lawyer said. "Protection is." By midday, the ripple spread. A private equity firm requested revised disclosures. Another asked for an internal audit. Grant's upcoming funding round was quietly labeled under reassessment. Grant locked himself in his office, hands braced against the desk, breath shallow. He replayed the meeting with Lynn in his mind, her tired voice, her lowered eyes, the way she had agreed too easily. He had underestimated her. Across the city, Lynn sat in a small meeting room with Ethan Cole and Julian Cross. No celebration, no smiles. "It's moving faster than expected," Ethan said, scrolling through updates. "Your signature triggered more than we planned." Julian nodded. "He's exposed now, and he knows it." Lynn looked down at her hands. "What happens next?" Julian met her gaze. Now he panics. As if on cue, Lynn's phone buzzed. Grant's name lit up the screen. She didn't answer. Back in his office, Grant stared at the unanswered call, anger boiling beneath a growing layer of fear. For the first time since he'd signed those divorce papers, he understood the truth. Marilyn Lynn Parker hadn't been waiting for mercy. She had been waiting for him to sign his own confession. And as the market began to quietly turn its back on Grant Holloway, the empire he'd built on control started to crack, piece by piece, signature by signature. The boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooked Wall Street like a glass throne. Grant Holloway had sat at that table dozens of times, always at the center, always in control. Today, he stood at the window instead, hands clasped behind his back, watching traffic crawl below as if the city itself had slowed to mock him. The emergency meeting had been called by his own board. That alone told him how serious things had become. When he turned, the seats were filling quickly. Advisors? Legal counsel. Two investors who had never attended internal meetings before. No one met his eyes for long. The air felt heavier than usual, dense with questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Then the door opened again. Grant expected another lawyer. Instead, Marilyn Lynn Parker walked in. The room stilled. She wasn't wearing a power suit or anything dramatic, just a tailored navy dress, simple, understated. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture was straight, calm, unhurried. She didn't look fragile. She didn't look defeated. She looked prepared. Grant's breath caught before he could stop it. "What is she doing here?" he snapped. Julian Cross stepped in behind her, closing the door. "She's here, at my invitation," he said evenly. "And with the board's consent." Murmurs rippled around the table. Lynn met Grant's eyes for the first time in weeks. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only clarity. That unsettled him more than rage ever could. She took a seat near the end of the table, folding her hands the same way she had during their last meeting. Familiar, disarming. "Let's begin," the board chair said carefully. "Mr. Holloway, we've been made aware of developments regarding your personal litigation exposure and its potential impact on company valuation." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Lynn spoke first. "I won't take much of your time," she said, voice steady, carrying easily through the room. "I'm not here to discuss our marriage. I'm here to clarify risk. Several heads turned toward her. The Parker Hale Trust has completed its preliminary activation review, Lynn continued. While assets remain restricted, beneficiary protections are fully enforceable. Any entity financially entangled with actions deemed coercive or retaliatory is subject to secondary review. Grant felt the blood drain from his face. That's not, he started. Julian cut in. It is, and documentation has already been submitted. A screen lit up at the far end of the room. Dates, filings, correspondence. Grant recognized his own signatures, his own motions, now reframed in a context he had never considered. This doesn't mean collapse, Lynn said calmly. It means accountability. The board chair cleared his throat. Miss Parker, are you seeking damages? Lynn shook her head. No. Grant looked at her sharply. I'm seeking distance, she continued, between my children and a pattern of behavior that puts image above life. Silence settled over the room. The board exchanged glances. Decisions were being made without words. Grant's voice came out hoarse. You planned this. Lynn met his gaze one last time. No, Grant, I survived it. She stood, nodding politely to the board. That's all. As she left the room, Julian followed. Behind them, the door closed softly. Grant remained standing, alone at the head of the table, surrounded by people who no longer looked to him for answers. Because in one quiet appearance, Marilyn Lynn Parker had done what he never believed possible. She hadn't begged. She hadn't accused. She had simply stepped back into his world and exposed it. The fallout didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, the way real power shifts always did. By noon, Grant Holloway's calendar was stripped bare. Meetings marked confirmed turned gray. 2 calls from investors went straight to voicemail, not unanswered, but deliberately ignored. In the glass-walled corridor outside his office, conversations stopped when he passed. People who once laughed too loudly at his jokes now avoided his eyes. At 1:17 p.m., the board chair requested his presence again. This time, Grant didn't stand at the window. He took his seat, fingers interlaced tightly on the table, jaw set in a practiced mask of control. Across from him sat the same faces, but their posture had changed. They leaned back now, evaluating, detached. We've reviewed the risk assessment, the chair began. And the external pressure. Grant nodded once. Temporary turbulence. One investor cleared his throat. It's more than turbulence. 3 funds have formally withdrawn. Grant's head snapped up. Withdrawn? Not divested, the investor clarified. Paused. Pending outcome. Grant felt something cold settle in his stomach. Outcome of what? Your leadership, another voice said. The word landed hard. Legal counsel slid a document across the table. Your actions, while not criminal, have exposed the company to reputational and regulatory vulnerability, particularly in light of the trust-related disclosures. Grant pushed the paper back. This company is me. The chair met his gaze steadily. That used to be an asset. Silence filled the room, thick and unmistakable. We're invoking the contingency clause, the chair continued. Effective immediately, the board will appoint an interim CEO while we reassess governance. Grant laughed, sharp and humorless. You're sidelining me because of a personal matter? We're protecting the company, the chair replied. From instability. The irony burned. Across town, Marilyn Lynn Parker stood in the NICU, one baby cradled against her chest, the other 2 sleeping peacefully nearby. Doctor. Reed smiled softly as she adjusted a monitor. They're doing remarkably well, she said. Lynn nodded, tears blurring her vision, not from fear this time, but relief. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She didn't answer. Back in the boardroom, Grant rose slowly, straightening his jacket. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. She doesn't even have access to the trust yet. Julian Cross's words echoed in the room through the board's counsel. Access isn't the point. Influence is. Thanks for watching. Grant's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had nothing left to argue. By evening, the internal memo was released, carefully worded. Temporary leadership transition. Strategic realignment. The market reacted not with panic, but caution. Stock dipped, analysts hedged, confidence thinned. Grant returned to his penthouse alone. Brielle's things were gone. A single note on the counter read, I need space. It's unimportant. He stared at the skyline, glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, realizing too late that everything he'd built depended on belief. And belief was fragile, because as Grant Holloway finally felt the weight of consequences settle in, he still didn't understand the most devastating truth of all. This wasn't the end of his punishment. It was only the beginning. Brielle Knox realized the ground had shifted the moment her invitations stopped coming. At first, she told herself it was a slow week. Manhattan moved in cycles. Gala season ebbed and flowed. But by the third unanswered text and the second canceled lunch, denial became impossible. Her calendar, once packed with rooftop cocktails, charity previews, and discreet dinners, was suddenly empty. She sat alone at a corner table in a cafe near Soho, scrolling through her phone, watching stories from women she used to stand beside. Same rooms, same chandeliers, same smiles, except she wasn't there. Her name had cooled. And in her world, that was dangerous. 2 weeks earlier, being Grant Holloway's partner had made doors open. Now it made them hesitate. Whispers followed her through rooms she was barely allowed into anymore, not loud enough to confront, just sharp enough to wound. She picked the wrong side. She overplayed it. She thought she was permanent. Brielle clenched her jaw, refusing to look shaken. She still had Grant, didn't she? She went to his penthouse that night without calling first. Let herself in with the key he'd once pressed into her palm like a promise. The apartment was dark, quiet, too quiet. Grant stood by the window, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at the city as if it had personally betrayed him. "You should have told me," Brielle said, breaking the silence. Grant didn't turn. "Told you what?" "That things were falling apart," she snapped. "I'm being iced out everywhere." Grant finally looked at her, eyes sharp and tired. "This isn't about you. It became about me the second your mess touched my reputation." She shot back. He laughed softly. "Your reputation?" Brielle's face flushed. "I stood by you." "No," Grant said coldly. "You stood beside power, and now you're realizing it wasn't yours." The words sliced deeper than she expected. The next morning, Brielle's agency called her in. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. They cited conflict risk and image instability. Her contract wasn't terminated, but it wasn't renewed either. A polite way of being erased. By afternoon, her phone rang again. Another client distancing themselves. Another opportunity put on hold. Meanwhile, Marilyn Lynn Parker's name surfaced in conversations Brielle was no longer part of, not as gossip but as gravity. People spoke carefully now, respectfully, as if correcting a mistake too late. Brielle tried one last move. She reached out to a reporter she knew well, offering insight into Grant's divorce. A subtle nudge, a chance to redirect blame. The article never ran. Instead, a quiet warning came back through a mutual contact. "No one wants to touch that story. Not her, not now." That night, Brielle packed her things from Grant's penthouse. No confrontation, no tears. Just efficiency. She left the key on the counter, beside the same untouched whiskey glass Grant had been staring at for days. Across the city, Lynn sat in a softly lit apartment Julian had arranged, rocking one of her babies to sleep while the others rested nearby. She didn't know Brielle's name anymore. She didn't need to. Because the woman who had believed she was replacing a wife had just learned a brutal truth. You don't win by standing beside a man who burns bridges. You fall with him. And as Brielle Knox disappeared from the rooms she once craved, the consequences of Grant Holloway's choices continued to spread, reaching everyone who had mistaken proximity to power for protection. Grant Holloway stood outside the hospital for nearly 10 minutes before he went in. The building hadn't changed, but everything else had. The revolving doors no longer felt like an entrance he controlled. They felt like a threshold he didn't deserve to cross. He straightened his coat anyway, habit overriding humility, and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Marilyn Parker," Grant said, lowering his voice as if that might soften the name. The woman checked the screen. "She's not listed under that surname anymore." Grant swallowed. "Then, Lynn?" Another pause. "Then, room 612. Visiting hours end in 20 minutes. He nodded and walked away before she could see the flicker of relief in his eyes. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. Each step echoed louder than it should have. Grant stopped outside the door, hand hovering, suddenly unsure of what he would say. Apologies had never been his strength. Neither had admitting fault. But this wasn't a negotiation. He knew that now. When he knocked, the voice that answered was calm. "Come in." Lynn sat by the window, one baby asleep in her arms, the other two resting nearby in bassinets. The light from the city washed over her gently. She looked tired but steady, grounded in a way he had never seen before. Grant closed the door behind him. "You look, well." She didn't respond to the observation. "Why are you here?" The directness caught him off guard. "I needed to see you," he said. "To talk." Lynn adjusted the baby carefully before meeting his eyes. "You had many chances to talk." He exhaled. "I didn't understand what was happening then." "No," she replied evenly. "You understood, you just didn't care. And we're teacher." Grant flinched. "That's not fair." She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't it?" Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of a monitor. Grant's confidence drained in that quiet. "I've lost control of the company," he said finally. "The board sidelined me. Investors pulled back. Everything is different." Lynn listened without expression. "I never meant for it to go this far," he added. "That's the problem," she said softly. "You never thought it would." "If you could for..." Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We could still fix this. Together. For the kids." The word hung there, heavy. Lynn's gaze hardened, not with anger, but resolve. "You don't get to use them now. They're my children," he insisted. "And you walked away from them before they could breathe on their own," she replied. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Grant's shoulders sagged. "I made mistakes." "Yes," Lynn said, "and mistakes have consequences." And 40. He looked around the room, at the life he had nearly erased. "I don't want to be your enemy." "I don't need an enemy," Lynn said. "I need distance." Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue, no leverage, no authority, just regret, arriving too late to matter. "I'll respect whatever you decide," he said quietly. She nodded once. "You'll respect the court's decision." Grant turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "You were stronger than I thought." Lynn met his gaze one last time. "I didn't become strong. I remembered that I already was." Grant left without another word. Lynn looked down at the baby in her arms, breathing steadily, alive. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, heart calm for the first time in months. Because the man who had once believed he could control her life had finally returned, only to learn that she no longer needed him for anything at all. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early enough that the courthouse halls still smelled of coffee and floor polish. Marilyn Lynn Parker arrived quietly, dressed simply, no entourage, no display. Julian Cross walked beside her only as far as the security gate. After that, she went in alone. She didn't need armor anymore. Grant Holloway was already seated when she entered the courtroom. He looked thinner than before, his confidence worn down to something brittle. His lawyer leaned in, whispering reassurances that sounded more like routine than belief. When Lynn sat across the aisle, Grant glanced at her, then quickly looked away. The judge entered, a woman with tired eyes and a voice sharpened by decades of family court. She wasted no time. "We are here to determine custodial authority and parental responsibility concerning the Parker Holloway children," she said. "Proceed." Grant's attorney spoke first. He argued stability, resources, familiar talking points, dressed up in legal language. He referenced Lynn's medical trauma, her temporary housing, her lack of independent income. He framed concern as responsibility. When it was Lynn's turn, she stood without hesitation. "I'm not here to argue who has more money," she said. "I'm here to show who showed up." Her lawyer submitted documentation. Hospital records, time-stamped visitation logs, statements from nurses and doctors. Dr. Naomi Reed's testimony followed, measured, precise, devastating. "These infants survived because their mother was present," Dr. Reed said. "Consistently. When insurance lapsed, when support vanished, when pressure was applied, she never left." Grant's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Then came the financial evidence. Not the trust, not the assets, just the actions. Insurance cancellations, emergency motions, the timing, the pattern. Grant shifted in his seat. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, she said, do you dispute that you terminated medical coverage within hours of your wife's surgery? Grant hesitated. I acted on legal advice. And do you dispute, the judge continued, that these actions coincided with ongoing negotiations affecting your corporate position? Silence. The ruling came swiftly. Primary physical and legal custody is awarded to the mother, the judge said. Supervised visitation only, pending completion of parental accountability counseling. Grant's shoulders slumped. Lynn didn't react. She simply exhaled. Outside the courtroom, Grant stopped her. This isn't fair, he said quietly. Lynn turned, meeting his eyes without anger. It's appropriate. You're cutting me out, he said. No, she replied. You stepped away. I just closed the door. She walked past him, sunlight spilling through the tall windows ahead. Julian waited at the steps, reading her expression before she spoke. It's done, Lynn said. He nodded. Good. That evening, Lynn returned to the apartment, where 3 cribs waited. She moved slowly from one to the next, touching each tiny hand, grounding herself in the reality she had fought for. Her phone buzzed once. A notification from Ethan. Custody order filed. Final. Lynn smiled softly. For the first time, nothing was hanging over her. No waiting, no fear, no leverage someone else could pull. Because the law had spoken, and it had chosen her. Grant Holloway lost the last thing he believed he could still control that day. Not his company, not his image, but the illusion that power could replace presence. The apartment felt different in the early morning light. Not bigger, not richer, just quieter in a way Lynn had never experienced before. The kind of quiet that didn't signal danger or abandonment, but peace. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and landed softly on 3 cribs lined up against the wall, each occupied by a sleeping miracle she still sometimes couldn't believe was real. Marilyn Lynn Parker stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Real coffee this time, not something rushed from a hospital vending machine. She watched her children breathe, slow and steady, and felt a calm settle deep in her chest. 90 days had passed. The Parker Hale Trust review concluded without ceremony. No announcement, no press, just a secure meeting room, a stack of documents, and Ethan Cole's steady voice confirming what had always been true. The trust is now fully accessible, he told her. You have complete authority. Lynn had nodded, absorbing the words without celebration. Money had stopped feeling abstract the moment she lost everything. What mattered now was what it could protect. She didn't buy a mansion. She didn't change her name. She did something quieter. She paid off the medical bills in full. Every nurse, every doctor, every night that had kept her children alive. She established a private medical fund for premature infants at the same hospital. Anonymous, no plaques, no announcements. And then she went home. Julian Cross visited one afternoon, not with documents, but with groceries tucked under one arm like an ordinary man. He set them down, rolled up his sleeves, and helped her assemble 3 impossibly small bottles while she laughed softly at the chaos. You don't have to do this, she told him. I know, Julian replied. That's why I want to. They moved carefully around each other at first. Respect before romance, trust before promises. Julian never asked for gratitude, never pushed. He showed up, over and over. That mattered more than words. One evening, weeks later, they sat on the balcony after the babies finally slept, Manhattan glowing in the distance. Julian turned to her, expression thoughtful. I don't want to be another man who steps into your life because you survived something, he said. I want to be someone who stays because you chose me. Lynn felt tears rise, unexpected and warm. I'm not looking to be saved, she said. I know, Julian smiled. I'm asking to walk beside you. End quote. 2 a.m. Across the city, Grant Holloway watched a very different skyline from a much smaller office. Interim leadership had become permanent. His name was no longer synonymous with certainty, just caution. He saw photos online, sometimes never Lynn's face, just glimpses of her life moving forward without him. He didn't reach out again. Lynn didn't think about him much anymore. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Julian knelt on the living room floor, 3 babies gurgling between them, and asked Lynn a question without drama or spectacle. No audience, no ring yet, just truth. Will you build a life with me? He asked. Lynn looked at her children. then at the man who had never tried to control her future. Yes, she said simply, because in the end, she wasn't rewarded with revenge. She was rewarded with choice, safety, love, and a future that belonged entirely to her. And as Lynn Parker closed the door on the life that once broke her, she stepped fully into the one she had earned, strong, whole, and finally free. The wedding was small by Manhattan standards, but perfect by Lynn's. No press, no photographers hiding behind hedges, just a quiet garden overlooking the Hudson, late afternoon sunlight filtering through tall trees as if the world itself had decided to soften for one day. White chairs, simple flowers, 3 bassinets placed carefully in the front row, guarded by people who had earned the right to be there. Marilyn Lynn Parker walked down the aisle slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted to remember every step. The air smelled like fresh grass and spring water. Julian Cross waited for her, calm and steady, not performing confidence, not proving anything to anyone. When he took her hands, there was no speech about fate or destiny, just truth. "We choose each other," Julian said quietly, voice carrying without effort. "Every day. Especially on the hard ones." Lynn nodded, eyes bright but steady. "That's all I ever wanted." They were married before the sun dipped behind the river. Later, as guests lingered with soft laughter and clinking glasses, Lynn stepped away for a moment, standing at the edge of the garden. She watched her children sleep, their chests rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm she once feared she would never see. Julian joined her, slipping his hand into hers without a word. Across the city, in a very different room, Grant Holloway watched the same sunset from behind a glass desk that no longer bore his name. The office was quiet, stripped of assistance and deference. His phone buzzed once with a news alert about a leadership award given to someone else. He didn't read it. Grant had tried to rebuild, new ventures, smaller deals. Nothing ever reached the heights he once controlled. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because trust, once broken publicly, never returned fully. He thought of Lynn sometimes. Not with anger anymore, with something heavier. Regret. He had believed power protected him from consequence. That belief had cost him everything that mattered. Back at the garden, Lynn raised a glass, not in triumph, but gratitude. "To second chances," she said softly, "and to the people who show up when it counts." There was no mention of Grant, no victory speech. He had already been handled by time, law, and his own choices. As evening settled, Lynn carried one baby, while Julian lifted another, the third cradled carefully by a close friend. The family moved together, imperfect and real, into the life waiting for them beyond that day. Later that night, when the garden was empty and the city lights shimmered in the distance, Lynn stood by the window of her new home, wedding ring warm on her finger. She thought back to the hospital hallway where everything had been taken from her without consent. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had survived, rebuilt, and chosen joy on her own terms. Grant Holloway would spend the rest of his life explaining what happened. Lynn Parker would spend hers living well. And that was the difference. Because in the end, the greatest justice wasn't the fall of the man who betrayed her. It was the full, peaceful life she built after him. Surrounded by love, dignity, and everything he once believed she didn't deserve. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, truly still here, then something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet but real way. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when life felt unfair. Maybe it mirrored a time you were abandoned, underestimated, or forced to start over with nothing but your own strength. Stories like this matter because they reflect a simple truth we often forget. We don't control what happens to us, but we always control how we respond. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Lynn didn't win because she destroyed someone else. She won because she chose dignity over bitterness, patience over chaos, and presence over power. Healing, as Marcus Aurelius wrote, begins when we accept reality without resentment and act with virtue anyway. If this story resonated with you, take it as a gentle reminder that your value is not decided by who left you, hurt you, or doubted you. It's decided by how you rise, quietly and consistently. And if you felt seen or strengthened by this story, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it tonight, and subscribe to our channel. Your presence here means more than you know.